There are 5 things every amateur stop motion animator does that you should never do as an animator. These things will not only ruin your animations, they will also ruin the viewer's experience, and that's really bad because the whole point of animation is to get the viewer engaged with your story. But don't worry, these 5 things are actually really easy to fix with some extra effort and time. So let's get started. In 5th place, we have the moving set. This one is very common in beginner animations, but it is also very common in professional animations too. In fact, I honestly still do this a lot. It is very difficult to reach in and move your character without bumping your set, just because Legos are so tiny, and usually the sets are tiny as well. Oftentimes, you won't even notice until you play your animation back, and by that time, it's too late. Unless you want to go ahead and reanimate the whole scene, which can take a lot of extra time. I'll get back to work. A good way to prevent your set from moving is actually just to use sticky tack. I use it a lot in my animations to help hold things that are very light and that can move very easily if my finger bumps them on accident. Also, whatever kind of animation you do, whether it's Legos or claymation, make sure that your set is sturdy. If your set is sturdy, you won't have many problems with your fingers bumping your set and moving it. Now, another way to prevent this is by playing back your animation after every new frame. You don't have to play back the entire animation, but most animation softwares will have a loop function where you can just loop the last few frames and it will automatically update every time you take a new frame. This helps so you can notice any bumps that you might have made to your set, and then you can go and just reanimate those right then and there, and you don't have to worry about getting all the way done with your animation and then finding out your set moved, and then you have to go and reanimate the entire thing again. So definitely use the playback function if your software has it. The 4th worst thing that will ruin your animations is flickering lights. I see this in so many animations, but luckily it is a very easy one to fix. The first thing you can do to avoid flickering lights is really just to close any windows. The sun is constantly moving throughout the day, and clouds are constantly coming and going and covering the sun, so it's always best to close your windows so that you don't have any changing light. Now you may think, wait, the sunlight doesn't change that much, it should be fine. Well, that's because when we're looking at it, we see it in real time. But in animation, it's basically a time lapse, so the light will look like it's changing a lot faster than it does in real time. Another thing you might want to do if you're using a ceiling light that has a fan on it is just to turn off the fan. If you leave the fan on, it will cause shadows to go by, and that will cause a lot of flicker in your animations. And by the way, if you are using ceiling lights, I would recommend just getting a different light source. Ceiling lights are not the most effective for animation, so I would recommend desk lamps or video lights, anything that you can get closer to your set. Now, if your lights are close to your set, make sure that you don't bump the light. If you have your lights on stands like I do, you probably won't have much of a problem with this unless you're very clumsy like I am sometimes. But if you are using desk lamps that either clamp onto your desk or sit on your desk, then you will want to be extra careful and make sure you don't bump those. Now, another common cause of flickering lights is light banding. These are from lights that are in a frequency that will cause banding. I don't know too much about this, but basically you'll see it a lot in video. It's not as common in animation, but it still does happen sometimes. To fix this, you just need a video light that doesn't have banding. That's why for stop motion, I usually recommend some LED light or some sort of video continuous light that doesn't have any flicker at all. You can also get by with an LED desk lamp, but honestly, I just prefer using video lights because they're brighter and they don't flicker and they just look better in my opinion. In 3rd place, we have too many frames with too low of a frame rate. This one is especially annoying to look at because it makes the animation look unrealistic and robotic. You may be thinking, well, doesn't more frames equal smoother animation? Well, actually, no, it doesn't. In order to have smoother animations, you actually need a higher frame rate to accommodate those extra frames. Frame rate is honestly one of the most confusing parts of animation, and it will take a while to learn, so don't worry too much if you don't understand it right now. So let me give you an example. Say you want to have a car whip around the corner really fast, and you want it to take 1 second. You might think, well, I need to make 24 frames, but then you might be playing your animation back at 12 frames per second. This would mean that the car would take 2 seconds to get around the corner compared to shooting 24 frames and playing it back in 24 frames per second, which would mean that you have 1 second for the car to get around the corner. Now, this all sounds really confusing, but all you really need to know is that 24 frames at 12 frames per second is 2 seconds, and 24 frames at 24 frames per second is 1 second. So the same amount of frames at 12 frames per second is twice as long as it is at 24 frames per second. That's why if you animate more frames, it will be a lot slower and it will look more robotic. The second thing that you don't want to do in your stop motions is not having enough weight. A lot of times I'll see stop motions where the character just looks too light. The problem with this is that viewers automatically think that certain objects will be a certain weight. For example, if a character tries to pick up a brick, they're obviously not just gonna pick it up really quickly. It's probably gonna take them a little bit to actually get the brick off the ground. Also, they might have to bend their knees a little bit to get enough leverage to pick up the brick. Now, if your animations don't look like they have enough weight, then you can fix this by using ease in and ease out. So when you think about it, when a character picks up a brick, the brick will accelerate slower than a feather would if the character picked up a feather. Another thing to keep in mind is squash and stretch. Heavier objects will generally squash a bit more than lighter objects. This is really just because of gravity. When you think about it, if somebody jumped off a roof and then they landed on the ground, they would probably have to bend down a lot to absorb the impact. On the other hand, if something light falls off the roof, it won't have much impact by the time it hits the ground. Now, a third good way to have more weight in your animations is to use exaggeration. I don't think I have to explain this one too much to you guys. It's basically just using exaggeration, exaggerating whatever happens in real life. You can try recording yourself and using that recording for referencing in your animation. Then you can just exaggerate everything more than what would actually happen in the real world. Now, the number one thing that will ruin your stop motions is not having a story. Story is easily the most important aspect of stop motion. If you don't have a story, the audience will not find any reason to actually finish watching your stop motion. The audience won't really feel any sort of connection to your animations if you don't have a story. Now, storytelling is something that I'm actually still working on. It's very difficult to master. However, if your story is amazing, all the other things I mentioned earlier won't really matter as much. Now, I'm by no means a master of storytelling, but the one thing I can tell you is that a good story will have a struggle. If the main character doesn't have any obstacles in the way of the goal, then the story is pointless. But if you make the goal extremely difficult to reach by adding all sorts of different obstacles, the audience can relate to that. That's why the best stories always have the most dire circumstances. You've probably been reading a book before and been like, why is it all going so terrible? I wish it was just going all well and smoothly. But really, if a story was smooth, nobody would read it. And it's the same with stop motion. You have to have a good story with a struggle so that the audience can relate with that struggle, and then when the hero will get past the struggle, the audience can celebrate with the hero even more. So the most important thing in animation is to have a good story. I really can't emphasize this anymore. If you want to see more examples of common problems in stop motion and how you can fix them, watch this video right here where I dive into my subscribers' stop motions.